They say a king who loses his crown can reclaim it through blood and steel. But what happens when he loses the only woman who ever saw past the monster he became? King Aldrich Vane ruled half the known world with an iron fist, until one night of weakness cost him his queen, his unborn child, and every shred of the man he thought he was. This is the story of how an empire crumbled, not from invasion, but from the silence of a woman walking away. Stick around till the end. You'll see why power means nothing when the person you destroyed refuses to forgive you. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. Let's build this tribe together. The northern wind carried ash through the palace halls that morning, a warning no one bothered to read. Aldrich Vane stood at the war room window, watching smoke rise from the training grounds where his soldiers prepared for conflicts that never seemed to end. 34 years old and already carved from scars and sleepless nights. His hands, rough, calloused, stained with decisions that haunted better men, gripped the stone ledge hard enough to crack mortar. Behind him, 3 generals argued over maps. Their voices blurred into background noise. Aldrich had stopped listening an hour ago. He was thinking about Celine. She'd left their bed before dawn again. 3rd time this week. He'd felt her slip away, heard her footsteps fade down the corridor, but pride kept him frozen beneath silk sheets that suddenly felt too cold. Pride. That poison he'd swallowed his entire life. The same venom his father had fed him since childhood. Never show weakness. Never apologize. Never let them see you bleed. The generals kept talking. Something about the western provinces threatening secession. Aldrich turned from the window, his shadow cutting across their maps like a blade. "You're boring me," he said. General Marcus froze mid-sentence. The other 2 exchanged glances that spoke volumes about fear barely concealed as respect. "Your Majesty, the grain shortage in—" "I don't care about grain," Aldrich interrupted. His voice carried that particular edge that made grown men reconsider their next words. "Send wagons. Raise taxes on the eastern merchants. They've been skimming profits for months anyway." He walked past them toward the door, his boots heavy against marble floors that cost more than most families earned in lifetimes. "The people are already restless," Marcus tried again. "If we increase, then remind them why they kneel," Aldrich said without turning. "That's what armies are for." The door slammed behind him hard enough to rattle ancestral portraits on the walls. Kings and conquerors stared down from gilt frames, judging him with dead eyes that had witnessed generations of vain bloodshed. His great-grandfather had built this palace on the bones of 12 rival houses. His father had expanded the empire by drowning 3 rebellions in their own blood. Aldrich had simply maintained what violence had already established. The corridor stretched ahead, empty except for servants who flattened themselves against walls as he passed. He ignored them. Ignored the whispered, "Your Majesties," that followed in his wake like prayers offered to deaf gods. Celine would be in the gardens. She always retreated there when the palace became too suffocating, when politics and blood and endless strategy crushed whatever illusions of peace she still tried to maintain. Aldrich found her beneath the ancient oak where they'd first met 7 years ago, back when he was just a crown prince with ambitions, and she was a diplomat's daughter with eyes that cut through his bullshit like winter through skin. She stood with her back to him, one hand resting on the tree bark, the other pressed against her stomach. Something in Aldrich's chest tightened. "You left early," he said. "Celine didn't turn. You were busy planning tomorrow's violence. I didn't want to disturb you." Her voice carried that particular exhaustion he'd been hearing more often lately. Not anger. Anger he could fight. This was something worse. Resignation, like she'd already accepted an ending he refused to see coming. "The council wants me to march on the southern territories," Aldrich said, moving closer. 3 provinces are talking independence." "Let them talk," Celine replied. Her fingers traced patterns on the bark. "You can't conquer dissent, Aldrich. You can only postpone it. That's treason. It's reality." He stopped a few feet behind her, close enough to smell the lavender oil she wore, distant enough to maintain the space that had been growing between them for months. "What's wrong?" he asked. Celine laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Where do I even start?" "Try the beginning." She finally turned. The morning light caught her face, highlighting features that still made his breath catch despite 7 years of marriage. But her eyes, those green eyes that once looked at him like he was more than just violence wrapped in royal titles, now held something that terrified him more than any battlefield ever had. Pity? I'm pregnant, she said. The words hung between them like smoke. Aldrich felt something shift in his chest, some long dormant part of himself he'd buried under years of strategic thinking and calculated cruelty. A son, an heir, the continuation of everything his father had demanded, everything the Empire required. When, he managed. 2 months, Celine said. I've been waiting for the right moment to tell you, but there hasn't been one. There's always another war, another rebellion, another reason why tomorrow matters more than today. She moved away from the tree, her hand still protective over her stomach. I'm tired, Aldrich. Tired of watching you become your father. Tired of pretending this life isn't slowly killing both of us. This life gave you everything, he said, and hated how defensive he sounded. This life gave me a crown I never wanted, and a husband who forgot how to be human. The accusation hit harder than any blade. I've kept you safe, Aldrich said. Fed the kingdom. Maintained order while every neighboring empire waits for weakness. You've maintained fear, Celine corrected. There's a difference. She walked past him toward the palace, then paused. I'm going to the eastern estates for a few weeks. My brother needs help settling some trade disputes, and I need distance from this place before it consumes what's left of me. You're running. I'm surviving. The distinction felt important, but Aldrich was too proud to ask what she meant. He watched her disappear into the palace corridors, watched the future he'd just discovered slip away before he'd even had time to process it. A son. The thought should have filled him with something close to joy. Instead, he felt only the weight of expectations already crushing a child not yet born. That night, the northern nobles threw a celebration in honor of some meaningless military anniversary. Aldrich attended because absence would be noticed, would be interpreted as weakness by vultures always circling the throne. The great hall blazed with torchlight and excess. Aristocrats draped in silk and jewels pretended nobility, while servants weaved between tables carrying wine that cost more than their annual wages. Musicians played songs about conquest and glory, sanitizing the screams Aldrich still heard in his sleep. He sat at the high table, watching the performance with the detachment of a man who'd long stopped caring about theater. Lady Cassandra Thorne approached during the third course, when wine had loosened inhibitions and dimmed better judgment. Your Majesty looks troubled, she said, taking the seat beside him without invitation. Cassandra Thorne, daughter of Lord Victor Thorne, one of the oldest bloodlines in the kingdom. Beautiful in that calculated way women of ambition mastered early, every gesture practiced, every smile strategic. She'd been circling the throne for years, waiting for opportunity. I'm fine, Aldrich said. The Queen left today, Cassandra observed, her voice pitched low enough that only he could hear. Strange timing, with the provinces so unstable. She's visiting family. Of course, Cassandra's fingers traced the rim of her wine glass. Still, the court notices these absences. People talk. Let them. She leaned closer, and Aldrich caught the scent of something sweet and cloying. He should have moved away. Should have recognized manipulation wrapped in perfume and low necklines. Instead, he reached for his wine. You carry so much weight alone, Your Majesty, Cassandra continued. A king needs counsel he can trust, support from those who understand the burdens of power. I have advisors. I'm not talking about advisors. Her hand found his arm, fingers light against royal silk. Aldrich looked at those fingers, at the woman attached to them, at the offer being made in the space between words. He thought about Celine's exhausted eyes, about the distance growing between them like winter frost, about the child she carried while walking away from everything he'd built. The wine tasted bitter, but he drained it anyway. Hours later, hours he'd spend the rest of his life trying to forget, Aldrich woke in chambers that weren't his, beside a woman who wasn't his wife. Moonlight cut through silk curtains, illuminating the mistake carved into every shadow. Cassandra slept beside him, one arm draped across his chest with possessive familiarity. The weight of what he'd done hit like falling iron. He'd broken the one thing in his life that mattered. Shattered it for what? A moment of weakness? Wounded pride? The pathetic comfort of feeling wanted when the woman he loved had stopped looking at him like he was worth saving? Aldrich extracted himself carefully, gathered his clothes with shaking hands. Every movement felt like walking through broken glass. His skin crawled with shame and wine sickness, and the terrible clarity that comes when you realize you've destroyed something irreplaceable. Cassandra stirred as he dressed. "Your Majesty," she murmured, her voice still thick with sleep and satisfaction. "When will I see you again?" "Never," Aldrich said, the word falling like an executioner's blade. Her eyes widened. "But we—" This was a mistake. He left before she could respond, before the implications of what he'd done could catch up to the action itself. The palace corridors were empty, silent except for his footsteps echoing against stone that suddenly felt like prison walls. Dawn was breaking when he reached his chambers. He stripped off clothes that reeked of betrayal, scrubbed his skin until it burned, but no amount of water could wash away what he'd done. 3 days passed before Celine returned to the capital. Aldrich tried everything, sent letters she didn't answer, dispatched messengers she sent back without messages. He told himself he'd explain, apologize, make her understand it meant nothing. But lies taste different when you're choking on them. The summons came on the 4th morning. The Queen requested his presence in her private chambers. Formal language, official tone, the kind of communication used between enemies, not lovers. Aldrich walked those corridors like a man approaching his own execution. Celine stood by the window when he entered, her posture rigid with carefully controlled rage. On the desk between them lay papers he didn't need to read to recognize. Divorce decrees. Lady Cassandra was kind enough to inform the entire court of your evening together, Celine said without turning. Very thoughtful of her. Saved me the embarrassment of being the last to know my husband fucked a power-hungry snake while I was away. The vulgarity sounded wrong in her mouth, violence forced past lips that used to speak his name with tenderness. "Celine, please, don't!" Her voice cracked like ice. "Don't you dare try to explain this away." She finally faced him, and Aldrich saw devastation in eyes that once held kingdoms. Tears tracked down her face, but her voice remained steady through sheer force of will. "I've given you 7 years," she said. 7 years of standing beside a man slowly transforming into a monster. I've defended you to every noble who questioned your brutality. I've smiled through state dinners while you planned tomorrow's bloodshed. I've carried your child while you carried on the vain legacy of conquest and cruelty. Her hand pressed against her stomach, protective and final. But I won't raise our baby in this palace of lies. I won't watch you teach our son that power justifies betrayal, that crowns excuse violence, that being a Vane means being exactly the kind of man I've spent 7 years trying to save you from becoming. You can't leave, Aldrich said, hating the desperation creeping into his voice. The kingdom— Fuck the kingdom, Celine interrupted. Fuck your empire and your legacy and every justification you've wrapped around your father's poison. I'm done sacrificing myself on the altar of vain ambition. She moved to the desk, gathered the papers with trembling hands. Sign these, she said. Let me go. I love you. The words tasted true, but truth means nothing when it comes too late. You love power, Celine corrected. You love control. You love the idea of me standing beside your throne, validating every terrible choice you make. But love? Real love requires sacrifice, Aldrich. It requires being vulnerable enough to choose someone else's well-being over your own pride. She pushed the papers toward him. You've never loved anything more than you love being king. The accusation hung between them like an open wound. Aldrich wanted to deny it, wanted to prove her wrong with words that wouldn't come. But standing there, watching the woman he'd destroyed pack away their entire history into legal documents, he realized she was right. He'd chosen the crown over her 1,000 times. Chosen violence over vulnerability, chosen his father's legacy over their future, and now payment had come due. I won't sign, he said. You don't have a choice, Celine replied. I'll take this to the High Council. They'll grant the divorce to avoid scandal. Lady Cassandra made sure half the kingdom knows what happened. She moved toward the door, each step widening the distance between them. Where will you go? Aldrich asked. Anywhere you're not. The door closed behind her with devastating finality. For 3 days, Aldrich tried to undo what couldn't be undone. He banished Lady Cassandra from court, exiled her family to the borderlands. He sent gifts Celine returned unopened. He threatened the High Council when they sided with the Queen, reminded them that kings didn't ask permission. But power that worked on nobles and generals meant nothing against a woman who'd already decided he wasn't worth forgiving. On the fourth night, one of Celine's handmaids brought news that stopped Aldrich's heart. The queen had fled the capital, left in the dead of night with 2 guards and no destination. She was 3 months pregnant and alone in a kingdom tearing itself apart. Aldrich mobilized the entire royal army searching for her, dispatched scouts to every province, every port, every distant estate where she might seek refuge. Days became weeks. Weeks became months of silence that felt like drowning. The kingdom noticed. Of course they noticed. A queen disappearing without explanation, a king growing more unstable with each passing day. Noble families who'd spent years fearing Aldrich's strength suddenly saw weakness, saw opportunity. Rebellions sparked in the southern provinces. Trade alliances dissolved. Whispers of conspiracy echoed through palace corridors where loyalty used to mean something. Then the letter arrived. It came from Lord Victor Thorne, Cassandra's father, a snake who'd been waiting for this moment since Aldrich had exiled his daughter. The parchment contained 3 sentences that shattered what remained of Aldrich's world. Your Majesty should know the Queen was attacked by assassins in the Eastern Territories. She survived. The child did not. Aldrich read those words until they stopped making sense, until the meaning bled through every defense he'd built against feeling anything at all. Celine had lost their child. Lost it while running from him. Lost it to assassins paid by his enemies. Enemies who'd smelled blood in the water the moment his marriage collapsed. Lost it because he'd been too proud, too stubborn, too much his father's son to recognize what mattered until it was already gone. The letter slipped from his fingers. Around him, the palace continued its daily operations. Servants cleaned, guards patrolled, advisors plotted responses to rebellions spreading like plague. The empire kept turning because empires don't stop for one man's grief, no matter how many crowns he wears. But Aldrich Vane, king, conqueror, inheritor of violence, sat alone in chambers that suddenly felt like tombs and understood with crystal clarity that he destroyed everything that ever mattered for a throne he never actually wanted. His father's voice echoed through memory. Never show weakness. Never apologize. Never let them see you bleed. Aldrich started laughing, a sound scraped raw from somewhere deep and broken. He laughed until it became something else entirely, until the king everyone feared disappeared and only the man remained, the man who'd traded love for legacy and found himself ruler of nothing that mattered. Outside, the kingdom burned. Inside, Aldrich Vane finally understood the difference between power and strength. But understanding came too late, as it always does for men who mistake crowns for worth and control for love. The war was just beginning, and he'd already lost everything that ever made him human. Somewhere in the Eastern Territories, Celine Ashford stood on coastal cliffs watching waves destroy themselves against rocks that would never yield. Her hand rested on a stomach no longer carrying futures that would never be. Behind her, a small cottage held the pieces of a life she was trying to build from the wreckage of the one she'd escaped. She didn't cry anymore, couldn't afford tears when survival required every ounce of strength she had left. But sometimes, when the wind carried certain sounds, she heard echoes of the man Aldrich used to be, back before crowns and conquest turned him into someone she couldn't save. She'd loved that man once. The king he became had killed him long before she ever walked away. The reports came in fragments, like pieces of a mirror reflecting nothing but ruin. Aldrich sat in the war room surrounded by maps marked with red. Cities burning, provinces declaring independence, noble houses that had sworn loyalty for generations now openly arming against the crown. The kingdom his father had built through calculated violence was tearing itself apart, and everyone knew why. The king had gone soft, lost his edge, let a woman walk away and took half his spine with her. General Marcus stood across the table, eyes fixed on anything except Aldrich's face. The old soldier had seen 3 generations of vain rulers, survived campaigns that killed better men, but even he looked uncertain now. The western garrisons are refusing orders, Marcus said, his voice careful. Lord Brennan claims he no longer recognizes your authority. Brennan, a minor house that wouldn't exist without Vane protection. Aldrich felt something cold settle in his chest, something that tasted like his father's ghost whispering told you so. Send the 5th Legion, Aldrich said. Burn his estates to foundation stones. Your Majesty, that would... Did I stutter? Marcus flinched. The room went silent except for the crackling fireplace and the distant sounds of a city that didn't trust its king anymore. It's not just Brennan, another advisor spoke up. Lord Victor Thorne has been rallying the southern families. They're calling for a council to discuss succession. Succession. The word hung in the air like drawn steel. Aldrich stood so fast his chair crashed backward. Every man in the room took an involuntary step back. Good. Let them remember fear, even if they'd forgotten respect. Victor Thorne sent assassins after my wife, Aldrich said, his voice dropping to something deadly quiet. After the Queen. After my unborn child. And now he wants to discuss who wears this crown? We have no proof it was Thorne, Marcus tried. I don't need proof. I need his head on a spike outside the palace gates. The advisors exchanged glances. Aldrich saw it. That particular look shared between men who'd already decided their leader was losing his mind. He'd seen that same look in the eyes of his father's council right before the old king drowned them all in a purge that still haunted palace corridors. Your Majesty, one of the younger generals ventured, perhaps if we negotiated... Negotiated? Aldrich laughed, and the sound carried no humor. You negotiate from strength. We're bleeding from every border while vultures circle waiting for me to show weakness. Then show strength, Marcus said quietly. The old general met Aldrich's eyes for the first time that morning. There was something in that gaze, not quite pity, not quite judgment. Understanding, maybe. The kind that comes from watching men destroy themselves over and over through history. Find the Queen, Marcus continued. Bring her back. Prove to the kingdom their king hasn't abandoned everything for guilt. She doesn't want to be found. Then make her want. You're a king, not some lovesick fool. The words hit harder than any blade. Aldrich stared at his oldest advisor, at the man who'd taught him strategy and warfare, who'd stood beside his father through campaigns that wrote themselves in blood across entire provinces. Marcus was right. Of course he was right. Kings didn't beg, didn't grovel, didn't let kingdoms fracture because one woman decided she was done saving them from themselves. But Selene wasn't just one woman. She was the only person who'd ever looked past the crown and seen something worth fighting for beneath all the violence and legacy. And he'd destroyed that, burned it to ash for one night of weakness he couldn't even remember without wanting to tear his own skin off. Find her, Aldrich said finally. Every scout, every informant, every coin in the treasury if that's what it takes. I want to know where she is before dawn. The council dispersed like smoke, leaving Aldrich alone with maps that showed an empire eating itself alive. He traced the coastal territories with one finger, imagining Selene somewhere out there, carrying grief he'd given her, surviving in a world he'd made too dangerous for the only good thing he'd ever held. His hand curled into a fist, crumpling the map edge. This was his father's legacy. This hunger that consumed everything soft until only the brutal remained. Aldrich had spent his entire life trying to be what the old king demanded, harder, colder, more willing to sacrifice anything for power. And look where that got him. Alone in a palace that felt like a mausoleum, wearing a crown that weighed more than kingdoms. The door opened without knocking. Aldrich turned, expecting Marcus with more bad news. Instead, Lady Cassandra Thorne stood in the doorway. She shouldn't have been within 100 miles of the capital. Aldrich had exiled her entire family, made it crystal clear that showing her face again meant execution. But here she was, dressed in traveling leathers, her hair wind-tangled, eyes bright with something between desperation and calculation. You've got 10 seconds before I call the guards, Aldrich said. I have information about the Queen, Cassandra said quickly. About where she's hiding. Aldrich's hand moved to the dagger at his belt. Lies taste different when you've swallowed enough of them. Talk. Cassandra stepped inside, closed the door. Every instinct screamed at Aldrich to gut her where she stood. This woman had destroyed his marriage, used him like a weapon against his own happiness, played games with his life for political advantage. But if she actually knew where Selene was... My father's men tracked her to the eastern coast, Cassandra said. A fishing village called Ashvale. She's living under an assumed name, working as a healer. Why tell me this? Because my father plans to finish what his assassins started. The words dropped like stones into still water. Aldrich crossed the room in 3 strides, had Cassandra against the wall with the dagger pressed to her throat before conscious thought caught up to instinct. She didn't flinch, didn't even look surprised. "Your father sent those men," Aldrich growled. "Of course he did." Cassandra's voice stayed steady despite cold steel against her pulse. "You think that night we shared was accident? My father orchestrated everything. Used me to fracture your marriage, create the instability he needed to challenge your throne." She met his eyes, and Aldrich saw something almost like regret buried beneath layers of political training. "I was a fool who believed sleeping with a king would make me a queen," she continued. "Instead, I became the weapon that killed an innocent woman's baby and started a civil war." Aldrich's hand trembled. One slice and this problem disappeared. One cut and he'd never have to look at living proof of his worst mistake again. But killing her wouldn't bring Celine back, wouldn't restore what he'd broken. "When?" he demanded. "My father moves at dawn. He's hiring mercenaries, 40 men, enough to burn the entire village if they have to." Aldrich released her, stepped back. His mind raced through logistics. Ashvale was 3 days' hard ride. He could take the Royal Guard, move fast, intercept before... "You can't bring an army," Cassandra said, reading his thoughts. "The moment villagers see royal colors, they'll scatter. Celine will disappear, and you'll never find her again." "Then what do you suggest?" "Go alone, or with one man you trust completely. Arrive quiet. Get her out before my father's mercenaries turn that village into a graveyard." It was tactical suicide. Every ounce of training screamed against it. Kings didn't ride into danger alone, didn't abandon their thrones during crisis, didn't make decisions based on emotion instead of strategy. But Aldrich was so tired of being what kings were supposed to be. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. Cassandra's expression flickered with something almost human. "Because I have to live with what I did," she said quietly. "Because that baby died because of choices I made. Because maybe if you save the queen, it balances the scales even a fraction." She moved toward the door, paused with her hand on the frame. "Or maybe I just want to see if the man Celine fell in love with still exists under all that crown and cruelty. Either way, you're running out of time." Then she was gone, leaving Aldrich alone with a choice that would determine everything. He could stay, defend the throne, send soldiers to extract Celine while he played king and let duty consume what remained of his humanity. Or he could ride. The decision took less than a heartbeat. Aldrich found Marcus in the training yard, drilling young soldiers who still believed wars were won through bravery instead of brutality. The old general saw Aldrich approaching and dismissed the recruits with a gesture. "I'm leaving," Aldrich said without preamble. "Tonight. I need you to hold the capital until I return." Marcus didn't even blink. "Where?" "East." "I can't tell you more than that." "How long?" "A week. Maybe less if I ride hard." The general studied Aldrich's face with eyes that had witnessed 3 generations of vain madness. Whatever he saw there made him nod slowly. "The council will demand answers," Marcus said. "Tell them their king is handling threats personally. Tell them whatever keeps them from tearing each other apart until I get back. And if they won't listen, then put anyone who causes problems in chains until I return to execute them myself." Marcus almost smiled. "That's more like your father." "No," Aldrich said. "My father would burn the kingdom before admitting he was wrong about anything. I'm trying something different." He gripped the general's shoulder, felt old muscle beneath old leather. "If I don't come back, make sure the throne goes to someone who isn't a Vane. We've done enough damage." Marcus's expression went carefully blank. "Your Majesty." "That's an order, General." Aldrich left before the conversation could continue, before doubt could creep in and remind him of all the reasons this was insanity. He took 1 horse, no colors, weapons hidden beneath a traveler's cloak that smelled like dust and distance. The stable master knew better than to ask questions. Aldrich rode out through the servants' gate as the sun bled red across western mountains, leaving behind a palace that had never felt like home anyway. The first night he made camp in woods that bordered estates his family had claimed through conquest 2 generations back. He built a fire, ate dried meat that tasted like ash, and tried not to think about Celine's face the last time she'd looked at him. But memory had teeth that wouldn't let go. He remembered the way she used to laugh at his attempts at poetry, how she'd argued politics with his advisors and won more often than not. The The particular expression she made when she thought he wasn't looking, somewhere between exasperation and affection, like she couldn't quite believe she'd fallen for someone so fundamentally damaged. 7 years they'd had. 7 years of her trying to sand down his sharp edges while he tried to protect her from the violence his name carried. He'd failed, obviously. You can't protect someone from yourself. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the darkness, predators hunted smaller things. The natural order playing out the way it always did. Strong consuming weak, survival demanding sacrifice. His father's voice whispered through the flames, "Weakness is death. Mercy is suicide. The moment you prioritize anything over power, you've already lost." Aldrich threw another branch on the fire and watched it burn. Maybe losing was the point. Maybe spending your whole life winning at the cost of everything that mattered wasn't victory at all. Just slow erosion until nothing remained except the hollow shell power required. He rode harder the second day, pushing the horse to limits that bordered on cruelty. The landscape shifted from cultivated estates to wild country, where villages appeared like scattered dice between stretches of forest and field. People here didn't know their king's face, didn't recognize royalty without crowns and ceremony. It felt like freedom, or the closest thing to freedom a man carrying his particular weight could experience. He stopped at a tavern that night, paid for a room and a meal with common coins he'd grabbed from the palace treasury. The innkeeper was a weathered woman who looked at him with the universal suspicion reserved for travelers carrying expensive weapons and no good explanations. "Rough roads ahead," she said, sliding a plate of stew across the bar. "Bandits been hitting travelers pretty regular." "I can handle bandits," Aldrich said. "Sure." She didn't sound convinced. Everyone can handle bandits until they can't. The stew was better than anything served at state dinners. Aldrich ate in silence, listening to conversations flow around him. Farmers complaining about taxes, merchants worried about trade routes, a young couple arguing about whether to move west where opportunities supposedly existed for people willing to work hard. Normal problems. Normal lives. No one knew a king sat among them, eating their food, envying their smallness. A man stumbled over drunk and belligerent, sizing up Aldrich with bleary aggression. "You look like you got coin," the drunk slurred. "Move along," Aldrich said quietly. "Or what?" The drunk's hand moved toward a knife that had seen better days. The entire tavern went still. Aldrich felt that familiar weight settle over him, the cold calculation that came before violence, the muscle memory of 1,000 training sessions and actual combat honed until response became instinct. He could break this fool in seconds, snap his arm, crush his windpipe, leave him bleeding on sawdust floors while everyone else learned why you don't threaten men carrying themselves a certain way. But Seleni's voice cut through the bloodlust. "You love violence more than you'll ever love me." Aldrich stood slowly, hands visible, movements careful. "I don't want trouble," he said, "just passing through." The innkeeper appeared with a club thick enough to crack skulls. "Out," she told the drunk. "Now." The man muttered curses but stumbled toward the door. Crisis averted through someone else's intervention. Aldrich realized his hands were shaking. Not from fear, from the effort of not giving in to what his father had trained him to be. "You handled that well," the innkeeper said, eyeing him with new assessment. "Most men would have started swinging. Most men aren't trying to become something different than what they were raised to be," Aldrich said. The words surprised him. He hadn't meant to speak them aloud. The innkeeper smiled, something knowing in it. "We're all trying to outrun something, stranger. Some of us just carry heavier baggage." She left him alone after that. Aldrich finished his meal and climbed stairs to a room that smelled like cheap soap and other people's dreams. He lay on a bed that creaked under his weight and stared at ceiling beams until exhaustion dragged him under. He dreamed of Selene walking through fire, her belly swollen with the child they'd never meet, her eyes accusing him of crimes he couldn't deny. Dawn came cold and unforgiving. Aldrich rode out before the tavern woke, following coastal roads that narrowed as civilization thinned. The third day brought him to territories marked on maps but barely governed, places where royal law meant less than local strength, where justice was whatever the biggest fist decided. His kind of country, once upon a time. He reached Ashvale as the sun died behind him, painting the fishing village in shades of blood and gold. Small houses clustered around a natural harbor where boats bobbed like children's toys. Smoke rose from chimneys, nets hung drying on wooden frames. life continuing its small patterns, unaware that violence was coming on tomorrow's tide. Aldrich tied his horse outside the village and approached on foot. He'd wrapped his weapons, covered his face against coastal wind, become just another traveler seeking shelter. A boy playing with a stick sword looked up as Aldrich passed. The kid couldn't have been more than 7, all scraped knees and wild imagination. "You a soldier?" the boy asked. "Used to be," Aldrich said. "Now I'm just tired. My da says soldiers are heroes." Aldrich crouched down until they were eye level. "Your da is trying to protect you from the truth. Soldiers are just men who got good at surviving things that killed other people." The boy considered this with the seriousness children bring to hard concepts. "Did you kill lots of bad guys?" "I killed lots of guys," Aldrich said. "Whether they were bad or not depended on which side you asked." He stood before the conversation could go further, before this kid could see through travelers' clothes to the monster underneath. A woman called from a nearby doorway, telling the boy to come inside. Her voice made Aldrich's heart stop. It wasn't Celine, just someone with a similar cadence, a comparable tone. But for a moment, one crystalline moment, he'd thought, "Get yourself together," he thought savagely. "You came here to save her life, not fall apart." He found an inn run by an old man who asked no questions and accepted coin without conversation. The room overlooked the harbor, giving Aldrich a view of the entire village and the roads approaching from inland. The mercenaries would come at dawn. That's when these things always happened, early enough to catch people sleeping, late enough that darkness provided cover for approach. Aldrich had maybe 10 hours to find Celine and convince her to leave before her father-in-law's hired killers turned this peaceful village into a slaughterhouse. He waited until full dark, then slipped back into the streets. The village was small enough that systematic searching wouldn't take long. "Healer," Cassandra had said. Someone treating the sick. He found her in a cottage on the village outskirts, identified by the herbs hanging in the window and the line of people waiting outside despite the late hour. Aldrich watched from shadow as Celine worked. She'd cut her hair shorter, wore simple clothes that would scandalize court fashion, moved with exhausted efficiency as she tended to a fisherman's infected wound. No crown, no silk, no trace of the queen she'd been, but still beautiful in ways that made his chest tight. She finished with the fisherman, sent him off with bandages and instructions, then stood in her doorway breathing deep of salt air. For just a moment, her hand drifted to her stomach, a gesture so small and broken that Aldrich felt it like a blade between his ribs. "Celine," he said, stepping from darkness. She spun, eyes going wide, one hand reaching for something hidden in her sleeve. Then recognition hit and her expression shifted through shock to anger to something worse, weariness. Like seeing him was just another weight added to burdens already crushing her. "How did you find me?" Her voice carried none of the warmth he remembered. Cold, flat, dead. "That's not important right now," Aldrich said. "You need to leave. Tonight." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I'm not going anywhere with you. Victor Thorne is sending mercenaries, 40 men. They'll be here by dawn to finish what his assassins started." Something flickered behind Celine's eyes. Not fear. She'd moved past fear into territories darker and more final. "Then I'll die here," she said. "Better than living another day in your world." The words hit harder than fists. Aldrich took a step forward, and she retreated, hand tight on whatever weapon she'd acquired. "Don't," she said. "Don't come closer. Celine, please. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know what I did destroyed everything we built. But you can't—" "Can't what?" She cut him off, voice rising. "Can't choose death over watching you try to fix something unfixable? Can't prefer honest endings over your guilty conscience?" Tears tracked down her face, but her voice never wavered. "I lost our baby because of you," she said. "Because you couldn't keep your crown and your cock under control for 5 minutes. Because you valued power over partnership and legacy over love. That child died running from your mistakes, Aldrich. Died before ever drawing breath because its father was too busy being a king to remember how to be human." Each word landed like hammer blows. Aldrich stood there taking them because he deserved worse. "You're right," he said quietly. "About all of it. I am exactly the monster you think I am. But those mercenaries don't care about my crimes. They'll kill you and everyone in this village just to make a political point, then warn the village, help them prepare. But leave me out of it." She turned to go inside. Aldrich's hand shot out, caught her wrist. Not hard, not threatening, just desperate. Celine froze. I can't lose you again, Aldrich said. The words scraped out raw and honest. You can hate me. You should hate me. But please don't make me watch you die for my sins. She looked down at his hand on her wrist, then up at his face. Whatever she saw there made something crack in her careful armor. The man I loved died the night you betrayed me, she said softly. Whatever's left wearing his face isn't my problem anymore. She pulled free and disappeared inside, closing the door with devastating finality. Aldrich stood in the darkness, breathing hard, every instinct screaming at him to kick down that door, throw her over his shoulder, carry her to safety whether she wanted saving or not. But that's what his father would have done. That's what kings did. Took what they wanted, justified it as necessary, convinced themselves control equaled care. He'd spent 34 years becoming his father. Maybe it was time to try something different. Aldrich walked back to the inn, climbed to his room, and stared out at the harbor until an idea formed. Not a good idea. Not even a smart one. But the only one that gave Celine a chance to survive while respecting her choice to hate him. He had until dawn to prepare. The mercenaries would come expecting an easy target, undefended village, one woman hiding from the world. Instead, they'd find something else entirely. Aldrich checked his weapons, felt the familiar weight of steel that had ended more lives than he could count. He'd been a soldier before he was a king, had learned warfare in gutters and battlefields where victory meant breathing when others stopped. Time to remember what he'd been before crowns and legacy tried to turn him into something civilized. His father's voice whispered one final time, "Violence is the only truth that matters." For once, the old bastard might be right. Aldrich waited in the darkness, watching the road, counting hours until dawn brought the reckoning he'd earned through every terrible choice that led him here. Behind him, in a cottage that smelled like healing herbs and broken dreams, Celine Ashford tried to sleep. Neither of them knew the sun would rise on the kind of violence that changes everything. The point of no return was already behind them. Dawn crept over Ashvale like a predator testing the air before striking. Aldrich watched from the rooftop of the inn, every muscle coiled tight with the kind of tension that precedes violence. The harbor below was still quiet, fishing boats rocking gently in water that reflected the dying stars. Peaceful, fragile, about to shatter. He'd spent the night preparing the village as much as one man could. Woke the mayor, a grizzled fisherman named Cale who'd survived storms that killed younger men, and told him mercenaries were coming. The old man had looked at Aldrich with eyes that had seen enough life to recognize truth when it wore desperation on its face. "How many?" Cale had asked. 40. Maybe more. The mayor hadn't wasted time on questions about why, just started waking able-bodied men, distributing what weapons the village possessed. Fishing spears, gutting knives, tools meant for harvest, not war. It wouldn't be enough. Aldrich knew that with the cold certainty of experience. 40 trained mercenaries against 24 fishermen who'd never killed anything that didn't swim was arithmetic written in blood. But maybe it would buy Celine time to run. Movement on the eastern road pulled Aldrich's attention. Riders, lots of them. Armored shapes materializing from pre-dawn shadows like nightmares taking solid form. Victor Thorne's mercenaries had arrived early. Aldrich counted them as they approached. 43 men, all carrying steel that caught the first rays of sun. Professional killers hired to do what aristocrats wouldn't dirty their own hands with. He recognized the formation, the practiced efficiency. These weren't thugs. They were soldiers who'd found better pay in private violence. The lead rider raised a hand. The column stopped just outside the village perimeter. Smart. They were giving the place a chance to surrender first. Less resistance meant quicker work, fewer complications. Aldrich had used the same tactic 100 times during campaigns where mercy was a luxury and speed meant survival. A man dismounted, tall, scarred, moving with the confidence of someone who'd walked into worse situations and walked out counting coin. The mercenary captain, he cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "We're looking for a woman. Goes by different names, but you'll know her. Noble bearing, green eyes, probably working as a healer." His voice carried across the silent village like stones dropped in still water. "Hand her over and we ride out. Nobody else needs to die today." Aldrich felt something cold settle in his chest. The casualness of it, the efficiency. These men would burn the entire village if it came to that, kill every soul here, then ride back to Victor Thorne and collect payment without losing sleep. This was what power looked like, stripped of ceremony and pretense. Just violence offered as transaction. Mayor Kael stepped into the village square, flanked by a dozen men holding fishing spears like they might actually stop trained killers. Brave. Stupid. The kind of gesture that got good people killed. "We don't hand over our own," Kael said. His voice shook but held. "You want to take someone from Ashvale? You'll have to come through us." The mercenary captain sighed like a man dealing with predictable disappointment. "That's unfortunate," he said. "Boys, burn it." 43 men moved as one, a wave of steel and killing intent crashing toward the village. The fishermen braced themselves, spears leveled, terror and determination warring on faces too honest to hide emotion. Aldrich dropped from the rooftop. He hit the ground between the villagers and mercenaries, rolled, came up with both swords drawn. The blades sang as they cleared their sheaths, a sound that always preceded screaming. Everyone stopped. The mercenary captain's eyes narrowed, taking in this new variable. One man, armed well but standing alone. Suicide or stupidity? Then recognition flickered across the captain's scarred face. "Well, hell," the mercenary said slowly. "That's the king." Murmurs rippled through both sides. The villagers glanced at each other, confused. The mercenaries tensed, hands adjusting grips on weapons as calculations shifted. Aldrich Vane stood in the dawn light wearing common clothes and carrying uncommon steel, every line of his body broadcasting the violence he'd spent a lifetime perfecting. "You're a long way from your throne, Your Majesty," the captain said. "Lord Thorne didn't mention you'd be here." "Lord Thorne sent assassins after a pregnant woman," Aldrich said. The words came out flat and cold. "Now he's sent you to finish the job. That tells me everything about what kind of man gives your orders." The captain shrugged. "I don't judge clients, just complete contracts. Smart business." Aldrich shifted his stance slightly, adjusting for the angle of attack he knew was coming. "But this contract ends here. The woman is under my protection." "You and what army?" "Me and the understanding that I've killed more men than you've commanded." Aldrich let the threat hang there, watching calculations play across the captain's face. First one who takes a step forward dies before his foot hits ground. Second one bleeds out watching. After that, you might actually hurt me. He smiled then, and it was the expression his father used to wear before battles. Nothing human in it, just the cold mathematics of predators identifying prey. "Question is whether your contract pays enough to die for." The mercenary captain studied Aldrich with professional assessment, weighing odds, counting costs. The silence stretched taut as bowstrings. Then he laughed. "You're bluffing, Your Majesty. One man can't stop 43. I don't care how many crowns you wear." He gestured to his men. "Take him down. Non-lethal if possible. Thorne will pay extra for a captured king." The mercenaries surged forward. Aldrich moved. Everything his father had beaten into him, every lesson learned in blood, every instinct honed through campaigns that left provinces burning. It all came flooding back with crystalline clarity. The first mercenary died before he understood he was already dead. Aldrich's blade took him through the throat in a strike so fast it seemed like the man simply decided to start bleeding. The second lost his sword arm. The third caught steel through his ribs while still processing the screams of the first two. Aldrich spun, blocked, countered, became a storm of controlled violence that turned training yards into truth. This was what he'd been before crowns complicated everything. A weapon. A survivor. A man who understood that mercy was luxury you couldn't afford when breathing depended on being faster, harder, more willing to do terrible things. The mercenaries fell back, their professional confidence cracking as they realized they weren't fighting a king. They were fighting something that had learned to kill before it learned to rule. Behind Aldrich, the villagers watched in stunned silence. The captain rallied his men, shouted orders that restored formation. 40 against 1 weren't odds, they were certainty. Aldrich knew it. They knew it. But knowing and accepting are different things when the one is painting the dawn with your brother's blood. "Circle him," the captain commanded. "Spears first, tire him out, then close." They moved with renewed coordination, professional soldiers remembering their training. Aldrich backed toward the village square, keeping his flanks covered, breathing hard but controlled. He couldn't win this. Not long term. Maybe he could take another 5 or 6 before they brought him down through sheer numbers. Maybe he could buy the villagers enough time to... The arrow took him high in the shoulder. Aldrich staggered, his left arm going numb. He spun, searching for the archer, and saw her standing on a rooftop 50 yards out. Cassandra Thorne. She held a hunting bow, another arrow already nocked, her face expressionless as she drew and fired again. This one punched through his side below the ribs. Not fatal, not yet, but bleeding now, damaged, fighting at maybe 60% capacity. The mercenaries pressed forward, sensing weakness the way predators always do. Aldrich blocked a spear thrust, killed the man holding it, but took a sword cut across his back in return. Pain exploded white-hot through his nervous system. He pivoted, drove his blade through another mercenary, felt the wet resistance of steel finding organs, but there were too many. Too many blades, too many angles, too much blood leaving his body with each heartbeat. A mace caught him across the jaw. Aldrich went down, tasting copper and broken teeth. Boots slammed into his ribs, steel pressed against his throat. The world tilted sideways, sounds becoming muffled through the ringing in his ears. Above him, the mercenary captain's face swam into focus. "Should have stayed on your throne, your majesty," the captain said. "Politics is safer than heroics." Rough hands yanked Aldrich upright, stripped his weapons, bound his wrists with rope that cut circulation. Blood ran down his face, dripped from wounds that should have hurt more, but adrenaline was still doing its job, keeping pain at manageable distance. Through blurring vision, Aldrich saw Cassandra descend from the rooftop. She walked toward him with measured steps, bow still in hand, expression carved from something that might have been regret, if regret had teeth. "You lying bitch," Aldrich managed through split lips. Cassandra stopped a few feet away. "Not lying," she said quietly. "I told you my father was sending mercenaries. I told you when they'd arrive. I just didn't mention I'd be leading them." "Why?" "Because my father promised me a throne if I delivered both you and the queen." She glanced toward Celine's cottage. "A crown I actually earned instead of one I tried stealing through your bed." The mercenaries dragged Aldrich toward the village center. Villagers scattered, terror replacing whatever fragile courage they'd managed. Mayor Kale tried to intervene and caught a sword pommel to the skull that dropped him like wet rope. "Bring out the healer," the captain shouted toward Celine's cottage. "Now, or we start executing villagers." Silence. Then the door opened and Celine emerged. She looked smaller than Aldrich remembered, worn down by grief and survival into something harder and more brittle. But her eyes, those green eyes that had once looked at him like he was worth saving, blazed with fury that could melt crowns. "Let the villagers go," Celine said. "Your contract is with me." "Contract's expanded," the captain said cheerfully. "Now we've got a king too, 2 for the price of 1. Cassandra moved to stand beside the captain, studying Celine with an expression that might have been guilt if it wasn't buried under ambition. "I'm sorry," Cassandra said, and she almost sounded like she meant it. "But you have to understand, women like us don't get power without taking it. You were born to diplomats and married into royalty. I had to claw for every scrap." "So you murdered my child," Celine said flatly. Cassandra flinched. I didn't mean for that to, "Intentions don't resurrect the dead," Celine interrupted. She looked past Cassandra to Aldrich, kneeling in the dirt, bleeding from wounds that were starting to make the world swim. "You came for me." It wasn't a question, just observation delivered in a tone that carried no warmth, no forgiveness. Simple recognition of fact. Aldrich tried to speak, but his jaw wasn't working right. Blood filled his mouth. He spat it out, tried again. "Couldn't let you die for my mistakes," he managed. "Noble," Celine said. "Stupid, but noble." She turned back to Cassandra and the captain. "What happens now?" "Now you both come with us," the captain said. "Lord Thorne has plans that involve royal blood and strategic executions. Politics above my pay grade, but I imagine it ends with him wearing a crown." He gestured to his men. "Bind the queen. Kill anyone who interferes." Mercenaries moved towards Celine. She didn't run, didn't fight. Just stood there, accepting capture with the same exhausted resignation Aldrich had seen in her cottage doorway. He wanted to rage against it, to summon strength he didn't have, and fight until they killed him trying. Wanted to be the man she'd fallen in love with, instead of the monster wearing his skin. But his body had reached its limits. Blood loss and damage were dragging him toward unconsciousness, whether he fought it or not. The mercenaries bound Celine's wrists, yanked her toward the horses with efficiency born of practice. "Move out," the captain ordered. "We've wasted enough time on this backwater." "What about the villagers?" one of the mercenaries asked. The captain glanced around at the terrified faces watching from doorways and shadows. "Leave them. They're not worth the arrows. Small mercy." Aldrich clung to that thought as rough hands hauled him upright, threw him across a horse like cargo. The world spun. His wounds screamed protest. Consciousness flickered like candles in wind. He caught one last glimpse of Celine before darkness took him. She sat bound on another horse, staring at nothing, face carved from marble and grief. They'd both come to Ashvale seeking different kinds of escape. Now they were prisoners of the same ambition that had destroyed their marriage. Heading toward fates orchestrated by men who understood power was just violence dressed in ceremony. Aldrich's last thought before the black swallowed him was wondering if this was punishment or justice, and whether there was actually any difference between the two. Consciousness returned in fragments, each one bringing fresh awareness of pain. Aldrich woke to stone walls and iron chains, his body one continuous scream of damage. They'd stripped him to the waist, left him shackled in what looked like a wine cellar converted to holding cell. Torchlight flickered against damp walls. Somewhere above he heard footsteps and muffled conversation. He tested the chains. Solid. Professionally done. Someone knew how to keep prisoners secured. The door opened with a groan of protesting hinges. Victor Thorne stepped into the cell, flanked by two guards carrying crossbows. The nobleman looked exactly like Aldrich remembered. Silver hair, calculating eyes, the kind of face that smiled while signing execution orders. "Your Majesty," Thorne said, investing the title with mockery. "I must thank you for making this so much easier than anticipated." Aldrich said nothing, saved his strength for breathing through cracked ribs. Thorne circled him slowly, examining Aldrich like merchandise. "My daughter proved more useful than I expected. Told you exactly what you needed to hear, sent you riding straight into capture. Almost poetic, really." "Where's Celine?" Aldrich managed. "The Queen is comfortable," Thorne said. "For now. She's leverage, you understand. Insurance that certain noble houses accept my claim to the throne without excessive resistance." He stopped in front of Aldrich, close enough that the king could have headbutted him if chains allowed that kind of movement. "You see, Your Majesty, you've done me a tremendous favor. By abandoning your throne to chase after a woman who despises you, you've proven to every house in the kingdom that Aldrich Vane has gone soft. Lost his edge. Become the kind of weak, sentimental fool who prioritizes personal feelings over duty." Thorne's smile widened. "The council is already drafting articles of abdication. They'll present them as protecting the realm from an unstable king who fled during crisis. Very noble, very legal. And by the time you sign them, I'll have married Celine to legitimize my claim, executed you for abandonment of duty, and consolidated power under a new dynasty." "Over my dead body," Aldrich said. "Yes," Thorne agreed pleasantly. "That's rather the point." He turned toward the door, paused with his hand on the frame. "You know what's funny, Your Majesty? Your father would have seen this coming, would have executed me and Cassandra on suspicion alone, burned our estates to ash, salted the earth where our house stood. But you? You've spent so long trying not to be him that you forgot the first rule he taught you." "What's that?" Aldrich asked, though he already knew the answer. "Power demands ruthlessness. Mercy is just weakness wearing a prettier name. Your father understood that. You never did." Thorne left, locking the door behind him. Aldrich hung in his chains, bleeding and broken, and confronted the terrible truth he'd been avoiding his entire life. His father had been right. About everything. Every time Aldrich had chosen mercy over brutality, chosen trust over suspicion, chosen to believe in human decency instead of assuming betrayal, he'd been building the foundation of his own destruction. Cassandra had played him perfectly because he wanted to believe redemption was possible. The council had turned against him because he'd shown weakness. Victor Thorne was going to steal his throne because Aldrich had prioritized love over loyalty. And Celine, the woman he'd destroyed everything trying to save, was being used as a pawn because he'd been stupid enough to think sacrifice could erase betrayal. His father's voice echoed through memory with devastating clarity. The moment you prioritize anything over power, you've already lost. Aldrich had spent his entire life trying to prove that wrong, trying to be better than the brutal tyrant who'd raised him, trying to balance strength with humanity, power with compassion, and it had cost him everything. The door opened again hours later. Aldrich had lost track of time through waves of pain and blood loss. Celine stood in the doorway. She looked untouched. No chains, no visible wounds. They'd cleaned her up, dressed her in noble clothes that fit too well to be coincidence. Behind her, guards waited with drawn weapons. "They're making you watch," Aldrich said. His voice came out rough as gravel. Celine stepped into the cell. Her face revealed nothing. No anger, no pity, no satisfaction. Just exhausted resignation. "Thorne wants me to convince you to sign the abdication papers," she said. "Told me if you cooperate, he'll make your execution quick instead of public spectacle. And you agreed to ask. I agreed to see you one last time." She moved closer, close enough that Aldrich caught the scent of lavender oil beneath whatever perfume they'd forced on her. Close enough to see the hollowness behind her eyes. The particular emptiness that comes when you've survived losing everything that mattered. "Are you going to marry him?" Aldrich asked. "If I refuse, he'll execute every villager from Ashvale," Celine said. "Men, women, children. He'll burn the entire coast as example. So yes, I'll marry him. I'll legitimize his claim. I'll stand beside another throne and pretend it doesn't kill me." She knelt down until they were eye level. "But I want you to know something before you die," she said quietly. "I want you to understand that the man I loved, the one who used to read poetry and argue philosophy, who believed kingdoms could be governed through wisdom instead of fear, that man died long before you crawled into Cassandra Thorne's bed." Aldrich felt each word like blade cuts. "You spent so long trying not to become your father that you never figured out who you actually were," Celine continued. "Never developed an identity beyond heir and king and weapon. And when you finally had the chance to be something different, when we could have built something worth more than conquest, you chose the easiest path back to what you knew. Violence? Power? Control?" Her voice cracked, but held. "So I'm not angry anymore, Aldrich. I'm just tired. Tired of watching good men destroy themselves trying to escape legacies that have already consumed them. Tired of being collateral damage in wars between ambition and conscience." She stood, stepped back toward the door. "Sign the papers or don't," she said. "Either way, the king I married is already dead. All that's left is deciding whether his ghost wants to drag innocent people down with him." Then she was gone, leaving Aldrich alone with choices that had stopped mattering the moment he'd made the first terrible decision that led him here. Hours passed, days maybe. Time lost meaning in darkness and pain. Guards brought water, but no food. Kept him alive, but weakening. Standard procedure before executions. Easier to kill prisoners too sick to fight. Aldrich used the time to think. To really think, stripped of pride and pretense and the weight of crowns he'd never actually wanted. His father had been wrong, not about power, not about strength, but about what those things actually meant. Real power wasn't forcing people to kneel. It was giving them reasons to stand beside you. Real strength wasn't eliminating every threat before it emerged. It was being vulnerable enough to trust others and resilient enough to survive when that trust got betrayed. His father had ruled through fear and died alone, poisoned by advisors who'd spent decades waiting for opportunity. Aldrich had ruled through inherited brutality and ended up chained in a cellar, destroyed by the same methods he'd been trying to escape. Maybe there was a third option. Maybe strength and mercy weren't opposites but complements, and learning to balance them required being willing to fail, to change, to become something new. Or maybe he was just a dying man grasping for meaning where none existed. The door opened for the third time. Cassandra stood in the doorway alone, no guards visible behind her. She carried a keyring and wore an expression of terminal conflict. "This is stupid," she said. "What I'm about to do is the stupidest thing I've ever attempted." She unlocked his chains. Aldrich collapsed forward, caught himself on hands that screamed protest. Every muscle in his body had locked up during days of immobility. Blood rushed back into his extremities, bringing pain sharp enough to white out vision. "Why?" he managed. Cassandra helped him sit up, her touch clinical and careful. "Because I watched my father torture that woman for 3 days trying to break her into compliance," she said quietly. watched him threaten children and describe exactly how he'd make Celine watch them die unless she agreed to marriage. Her hands shook as she worked the chains, and she never broke, never begged, just stared at him with those eyes that made him see himself as the monster he is. Made me see what I'd become helping him. The last chain fell away. I can't undo what I did, Cassandra continued. Can't bring back your child or repair your marriage. But I can give you one chance to stop my father before he executes you at dawn and consolidates power through fear. Where is he? Aldrich asked. Great Hall, holding court like he's already king. 60 guards minimum, plus loyalists from houses that supported this coup. Aldrich tried to stand. His legs buckled. Cassandra caught him, surprising strength in her aristocrat's frame. You can barely walk, she said. How do you expect to— I've fought on broken bones before, Aldrich interrupted. Just get me close. She stared at him, searching his face for something. What she found there made her nod slowly. There's a servant's passage that leads behind the dais, she said. I can get you there unseen. After that, you're on your own. What about you? Cassandra smiled, sad and knowing. I'm the traitor's daughter who freed the prisoner. I'll be lucky if they only execute me. Then why help at all? Because some debts can't be paid with money or power, she said. Because maybe if I save one good thing, it balances the scale even a fraction. She helped Aldrich to his feet, steadied him when the world tilted. The servants' corridor smelled like old stone and older secrets. Cassandra guided him through darkness, one hand on his arm, whispering directions. They reached a hidden door behind the great hall dais. Through the wood, Aldrich heard Victor Thorne's voice addressing assembled nobles. The kingdom requires leadership unclouded by sentiment, Thorne was saying. Aldrich Vane proved himself unfit when he abandoned his throne chasing ghosts. I propose a new dynasty built on strength rather than nostalgia. Murmurs of agreement from the assembled crowd. Cassandra pressed something into Aldrich's hand. A dagger, short and balanced for throwing. Make it count, she whispered. Then she was gone, disappeared back into shadows that had birthed this entire conspiracy. Aldrich stood alone behind the door, breathing through pain that wanted to drag him into unconsciousness. His body was broken. His kingdom was conquered. The woman he loved despised him. Every choice that brought him here had been wrong in ways he was still processing. But he had one dagger and one chance to change how this story ended. Not for himself. That ship had sailed and sunk. For Celine. For the villagers who'd defended her. For everyone who'd suffer under Victor Thorne's idea of leadership. Aldrich pushed open the door and stepped into the great hall. Victor Thorne stood on the dais wearing crown jewels that didn't belong to him yet. 60 guards lined the walls. 200 nobles filled the floor, all dressed in their finest because power transitions demanded appropriate ceremony. And there, standing beside Thorne in chains dressed as wedding finery, was Celine. Every eye turned toward Aldrich as he walked forward. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, shock and disbelief painting faces that had already accepted new reality. Thorne's expression flickered through surprise to rage to something almost like respect. Remarkable, the nobleman said. You should be locked in a cell awaiting execution. Yet here you stand. Here I stand, Aldrich agreed. He kept walking, each step agony, each breath fire in damaged lungs. The guards tensed but didn't move, confused by Thorne's lack of orders, uncertain whether this broken king represented actual threat. Aldrich stopped 20 feet from the dais. You were right about one thing, he said to Thorne. His voice carried across the silent hall. My father would have seen this coming, would have executed you on suspicion and called it wisdom. He looked at Celine then, met those green eyes one final time. But he was wrong about everything that mattered. Power without purpose is just violence waiting to consume itself. Strength without compassion is just brutality wearing crowns. And any kingdom built on fear instead of trust will eventually eat its own builders. What's your point, Your Majesty? Thorne asked. My point, Aldrich said, is that I spent my entire life trying to prove my father wrong while using all his methods. Became exactly what I hated while telling myself I was different. He raised the dagger, felt its weight, its balance, its singular purpose. But you made one mistake, Thorne. You assumed I valued my life more than I valued stopping men like you from turning my kingdom into the hell my father built. Understanding dawned in Victor Thorne's eyes, a heartbeat before Aldrich moved. The dagger flew true, decades of training guiding steel through air toward the throat of ambition wearing stolen crowns. But Thorn was faster than expected. Moved with surprising speed, caught the blade mid-flight with reflexes honed through survival. Guards surged forward. Aldrich smiled as they crashed into him, bore him down beneath weight and steel and consequences he'd earned through every terrible choice. At least he'd tried something different. At least at the very end, he'd chosen sacrifice over survival. The world went dark beneath crushing pressure, and Aldrich Vane finally stopped fighting against the only enemy that had ever really mattered: himself. Death didn't come. Aldrich expected steel finding organs, expected the wet certainty of blades ending what should have ended hours ago. Instead, the guards pinning him down suddenly jerked backward, their weight lifting as screams erupted through the great hall. He rolled onto his side, vision swimming, and saw chaos. The doors had exploded inward. Through the splintered wood poured soldiers wearing colors Aldrich recognized, his own royal guard, led by General Marcus with a face carved from rage and vindication. Behind them came more men, hundreds of them, flooding the hall like a steel tide breaking against Thorn's conspiracy. How? The word barely made it past Aldrich's split lips. Marcus reached him first, hauled him upright with the same rough efficiency he'd used pulling wounded soldiers from battlefields. "Your little speech got out," the general growled. Someone in this hall had enough spine to send word that their king still lived. The great hall had become a slaughterhouse. Thorn's guards were outnumbered 3-1, caught between loyalty to a usurper and survival instinct. Some fought. Most threw down weapons and backed toward walls, hands raised in surrender that might buy them trials instead of immediate execution. Victor Thorn stood on the dais, his carefully constructed coup dissolving around him like smoke. For the first time since Aldrich had known the nobleman, genuine fear flickered across that calculating face. "Seize him!" Marcus commanded. Soldiers surged forward. Thorn grabbed Celine, yanked her in front of him as human shield, a dagger appearing at her throat with practiced speed. The hall went silent except for the wet sounds of dying men in boots on marble slick with blood. "Stay back!" Thorn shouted, "or the queen dies right here." Aldrich pushed away from Marcus, forced his broken body upright through sheer force of will. Every nerve screamed protest, but he stayed standing, fixed Thorn with eyes that had watched empires burn. "You've already lost," Aldrich said. His voice came out rough but steady. "Kill her and you're just a murderer instead of a failed conspirator. Let her go and maybe you live long enough to see a trial." "I'll never see a trial," Thorn spat. "You'll have me executed in some dungeon where nobody watches. Make me disappear like your father did to everyone who threatened him." The blade pressed tighter against Celine's throat. A thin line of blood appeared, ruby bright against pale skin. She didn't flinch, didn't plead, just stared at Aldrich with those green eyes that had seen him at his worst and somehow found reasons to love him anyway. "You're right," Aldrich said quietly. "My father would have made you disappear, would have tortured confessions from everyone you loved, burned your house to foundation stones, salted the earth where your name used to mean something." He took a step forward. Marcus tried to grab him, but Aldrich shrugged off the general's hand. "But I'm not my father," Aldrich continued. "I'm the fool who spent his whole life trying to prove violence isn't the only language power speaks. The idiot who believed kingdoms could be governed through wisdom instead of fear." Another step. Thorn's hand trembled, the dagger wavering. "So here's what happens, Victor. You let the queen go. You surrender to my general, and I personally guarantee you live to stand trial before the entire kingdom, every noble house, every common citizen who wants to watch. Full transparency, fair judgment." "Why would I trust you?" Thorn demanded. "Because I just gave you my word in front of 200 witnesses," Aldrich said. "Because breaking it would make me exactly what you accused me of being, a tyrant who rules through fear instead of honor." He stopped 10 feet from the dais, close enough to see sweat running down Thorn's face, close enough to watch desperation war with calculation behind those aristocratic eyes. "And because you know that blade at her throat is the only thing keeping you breathing," Aldrich finished. "The moment you hurt her, nothing in creation will stop my men from tearing you apart. But if you surrender, you get to live. Maybe even talk your way out of execution if you're half as clever as you think." The silence stretched taut as bowstrings. Aldrich could see Thorn's mind working, weighing odds, counting costs. The nobleman was smart enough to recognize checkmate when it had him surrounded, But smart men do stupid things when fear drowns logic. Time slowed to heartbeats. Then Celine moved. She drove her elbow backward into Thorn's ribs with surprising force, twisted away from the blade, and dropped low as guards surged forward. Thorn tried to grab her, but Marcus was faster, his sword taking the nobleman's hand off at the wrist. Thorn's scream cut through the hall like broken glass. He collapsed clutching the stump, blood pumping between his fingers, face gone white with shock. Soldiers surrounded him, weapons leveled, one wrong move from ending what had already become inevitable. Aldrich reached Celine first. She stood trembling, one hand pressed to the shallow cut on her throat, eyes wide with adrenaline and aftermath. He wanted to pull her close, to apologize for every terrible choice that led them here, to promise things he had no right promising. But the distance between them felt wider than the blood-soaked hall. "Are you hurt?" he asked instead. "I'm fine," Celine said. Her voice shook but held. "You look like hell. Feel worse than I look." Marcus approached, wiping Thorn's blood from his sword. "The throne room is secure, Your Majesty. We've arrested everyone who supported the coup. 300 prisoners awaiting your judgment." "How many dead?" Aldrich asked. 42 of ours. Maybe twice that many of theirs. Numbers. Statistics. Bodies that used to be men with families and futures, reduced to counts and reports nobody would remember next year. "Get the wounded to healers," Aldrich said. "Secure the prisoners in the lower dungeons. And someone stop Thorn from bleeding out before he can stand trial." Medics rushed forward, applying tourniquets to a nobleman who'd gambled kingdoms and lost. Thorn's screams faded to whimpers as shock took him toward unconsciousness. Aldrich turned to the assembled nobles still pressed against the walls, faces painted with terror and calculation, as they watched their king reclaim power through blood. "Most of you are guilty of nothing except attendance," Aldrich said. His voice carried across the silent hall, each word deliberate. "You came because Thorn commanded it, because refusing would have marked you as enemies. I understand that. Fear makes cowards of us all." He paused, letting them see the damage done to their king, the wounds, the exhaustion, the man instead of the crown. "But some of you knew," he continued, "helped plan this coup, sent assassins after my wife, conspired to steal a throne through murder and manipulation." The silence turned suffocating. "You have until dawn to confess your involvement to General Marcus," Aldrich said. "Full disclosure, complete honesty, names of everyone who participated. Do that, and you'll face trials instead of summary execution. Refuse, and when we uncover your guilt through investigation, and we will uncover it, there won't be trials. Just ropes." He gestured toward the doors. "Get out, all of you, and pray your hands are clean enough to survive scrutiny." The nobles fled like startled birds, tripping over each other in their rush to escape judgment. Within moments, the great hall stood nearly empty, except for soldiers, prisoners, and the physical evidence of violence that had nearly destroyed everything. Marcus approached again, his scarred face showing rare approval. "That was well handled, Your Majesty. Your father would have just executed them all and sorted guilt later." "My father built a kingdom that tore itself apart the moment he showed weakness," Aldrich said. "I'm trying something different." The old general almost smiled. "Different might get you killed. Then I'll die trying to be better than what I was raised to be." Aldrich turned to Celine, who'd remained silent through the entire exchange. She watched him with an expression he couldn't read. Not love, not hatred. Something complicated and wounded and exhausted. "We need to talk," he said. She nodded slowly. "We do." Marcus cleared his throat diplomatically. "I'll secure the palace and begin interrogations." "You should rest, Your Majesty. Get those wounds properly treated." "Later," Aldrich said. "First I need to have a conversation I should have had months ago." He led Celine through corridors still echoing with recent violence, past bodies being carried toward pyres, past servants cleaning blood from marble that had witnessed generations of vain brutality. They walked in silence, the space between them filled with everything unsaid. Aldrich brought her to the royal gardens, to the ancient oak where they'd first met 7 years ago, when everything seemed simpler. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades that made the world look almost clean. Celine leaned against the tree, one hand pressed to the shallow cut on her throat. The wound had stopped bleeding but would scar. Another mark left by violence surrounding anyone who got too close to the vain legacy. You saved my life, she said finally. Again. Aldrich stood a few feet away, maintaining distance that felt both necessary and devastating. I owed you that much after destroying it. You don't owe me anything, Celine said. We're even now. You betrayed me, nearly got me killed, cost me our child. Then you rode into suicide trying to save me. The scales balance. She looked at him then, really looked, and Aldrich saw something in her eyes that hurt worse than any wound. But balance doesn't mean healed, she continued. Doesn't mean forgiven. Doesn't mean we can go back to what we were. I know. The words came easier than expected, maybe because he'd finally accepted what he'd been avoiding since the night everything shattered. I spent my whole life trying not to become my father, Aldrich said quietly. Told myself I was different because I questioned his methods, because I wanted to rule through wisdom instead of fear. But I used all his tools, made all his choices, became exactly what I hated while pretending I had better reasons. He moved closer, close enough to smell lavender oil beneath blood and smoke. You were the only person who ever saw past the crown to whatever was underneath, he continued. The only one who believed I could be something more than violence wrapped in royal titles. And when you needed me to prove it, when our marriage and our child and our future depended on me actually being the man you thought I was, I chose the easiest path back to what I knew. Aldrich felt something crack open in his chest, something he'd kept locked away since childhood. I don't know how to be anything except what my father made me, he admitted. Don't know how to rule without threats, how to trust without suspicion, how to love without possession. Thorn was right about that much. I've gone soft trying to escape legacy, but I never actually figured out what to replace it with. Celine's expression softened fractionally, grief and understanding mixing into something almost like pity. You're not your father, she said. Your father would have let me die rather than risk his throne, would have executed Thorn without trial, purged every house that looked at him wrong, ruled through terror until someone finally put a blade in his back. She pushed away from the tree, stepped closer until they were breathing the same air. But you're not entirely free of him either, she continued. You still think in terms of control and possession, still measure worth through power and legacy, still carry violence in your bones like inheritance you can't refuse. What do I do? The question came out raw and desperate. Change, Celine said simply. Actually change, not just try to be slightly less brutal than your father. Figure out who Aldrich Vane is when you strip away the crown and the weapons and the weight of empire. Build something new instead of just maintaining what violence already established. She reached up, touched his face with fingers that trembled. And do it without me, she finished quietly, because I can't save you from yourself. Nobody can. That's work you have to do alone. The words hit like falling stone, final and irrevocable. You're leaving, Aldrich said. Not a question. I'm surviving, Celine corrected. There's a difference. She stepped back, lowering her hand. I'll stay until Thorn's trial, she said. Help stabilize the kingdom. Make sure your enemies don't use the transition to spark rebellions. But after that, I'm gone. Back to the coast, or maybe farther. Somewhere without crowns and conspiracies and men who think love is something you can control. Tears tracked down her face, but her voice never wavered. I loved you, Aldrich. Loved you so much it nearly destroyed me. But that love died the night you betrayed it, and no amount of heroics will resurrect what's already buried. Aldrich wanted to argue, to promise he'd change, to beg for one more chance to prove he could be worth her faith. But he'd spent enough of his life forcing people to accept what he wanted. Time to respect what she needed. I understand, he said. The simplicity seemed to surprise her. She'd expected resistance, expected the possessive king demanding what belonged to him. Instead, she got a broken man finally accepting consequences. Thank you, Celine said softly, for letting me go without making it a war. It's the least I owe you. They stood in the garden as dawn turned the sky from blood red to gold, two people who'd built kingdoms together and watched them burn, finally acknowledging that some damage runs too deep for repair. Your Majesty, a voice interrupted. Marcus stood at the garden entrance, his expression grim. We have a problem. Aldrich felt exhaustion settle over him like physical weight. What now? The prisoners are talking, Marcus said, and their confessions paint a picture worse than we thought. He glanced at Celine, then back to Aldrich. Victor Thorn wasn't the architect. He was just the face of the conspiracy. The real power behind the coup sits on your council, has been planning this for years, and they're mobilizing what's left of their forces for one final push before we can arrest them." "Who?" Aldrich demanded. Marcus's jaw tightened. "Lord Chancellor Brennan, your oldest advisor, the man who sat at your father's right hand and yours for 3 decades. The revelation hit like cold water. Brennan, the bureaucrat who'd survived 3 generations of vain rulers, the administrator everyone trusted because he seemed too boring for ambition, too useful to suspect. He'd been there when Aldrich's father died, had helped smooth the transition of power, had advised every major decision for years, and he'd been planning betrayal the entire time." "Where is he now?" Aldrich asked, though he already knew the answer. "The Western garrison," Marcus said. "He's declared himself regent, claims you're unfit to rule, and he's marching on the capital with 8,000 men. They'll be here in 3 days." Aldrich felt something cold and familiar settle into place. The exhaustion, the wounds, the broken pieces of his life. All of it faded beneath the clarity that came before battles that would determine everything. "How many soldiers do we have?" he asked. 4,000 here, Marcus said. "Maybe another 2,000 scattered across loyal territories. We're outnumbered and undersupplied. Brennan's been siphoning resources for months, preparing for exactly this moment." "Then we can't win through conventional warfare," Aldrich said. He looked at Celine, saw understanding dawn in her eyes. "You're going to do something insane," she said. "I'm going to challenge him personally," Aldrich replied. "Single combat. Winner takes the throne. Loser gets executed for treason." Marcus shook his head violently. "Your Majesty, you can barely stand. You're wounded, exhausted, fighting at maybe 30% capacity. Brennan will slaughter you." "Probably," Aldrich agreed. "But he's a bureaucrat who got fat on politics while I learned warfare and actual combat. And if I lose, at least the kingdom avoids civil war." "You're gambling everything on pride," Marcus said. "I'm gambling everything on being slightly better than I was yesterday," Aldrich corrected. "My father would have met Brennan's army with overwhelming force, burned the Western territories to ash, ruled through fear for another generation. I'm choosing differently." He turned to Celine one last time. "If I die, make sure the throne goes to your brother," he said. "He's a good man. Better than anyone carrying the Vane name." Celine's expression showed conflict warring with resignation. "Don't die," she said quietly. "Live long enough to actually become the man you keep promising to be." Aldrich almost smiled. "I'll try." Marcus grumbled protests but began issuing orders, sending riders with formal challenge to Brennan, mobilizing defenses in case the Chancellor refused single combat and attacked anyway. Aldrich spent the next 2 days preparing, not training. His body was too damaged for that. But meditating on what this fight represented. Not just survival, not just keeping his throne. A chance to prove change was possible, to show that men raised in violence could choose differently, to demonstrate that legacy wasn't destiny and sons weren't automatically doomed to become their fathers, or die trying. On the morning of the 3rd day, Brennan's army arrived. They filled the plains outside the capital, 8,000 men in perfect formation under banners that proclaimed legitimate succession. At their head rode Lord Chancellor Brennan himself, 60 years old, gray-haired, carrying weight that spoke of decades spent in council chambers instead of battlefields. But his eyes were sharp and calculating as he surveyed the capital walls. Aldrich met him in the traditional dueling ground between armies, a flat stretch of earth that had witnessed countless challenges throughout Vane history. Marcus had wanted to accompany him, but Aldrich refused. This was personal, intimate, the kind of reckoning that required facing your demons alone. He wore minimal armor, carried his father's sword, and moved with the careful precision of a man whose body was one wrong step from collapse. Brennan rode up on a warhorse that made Aldrich's simple approach look pathetic by comparison. "Your Majesty," the Chancellor said, investing the title with contempt. "I'm surprised you showed. Thought you'd send some champion to fight your battles." "I've had enough of other people fighting my battles," Aldrich replied. "Time to handle my own consequences." Brennan dismounted with surprising grace for his age. Up close, Aldrich saw the truth he'd missed for years. This wasn't a soft politician playing at war. This was a predator who'd survived by making others underestimate him. "Your father knew what I was," Brennan said conversationally as he drew his sword. "Kept me close because he recognized kindred spirit. You? You're too busy trying to be noble to see the knives until they're already in your back. He moved without warning, blade sweeping toward Aldrich's throat with speed that belied his years. Aldrich barely blocked, his damaged body screaming protest. They circled each other, steel ringing against steel, two men fighting for kingdoms and legacies and the right to define what power actually meant. You can't win, Brennan said between strikes. Even healthy, you'd struggle. Broken like this? You're dead already. Maybe, Aldrich gasped, blocking another combination that drove him backward. But at least I'll die trying to be something different. Different is just weakness wearing prettier names, Brennan snarled. He pressed the attack, decades of hidden training revealing itself in strikes that pushed Aldrich toward limits already exhausted. Blood ran from reopened wounds. Vision swam. Every breath was fire. But Aldrich kept fighting, not because he thought he could win, not because survival instinct demanded it, because Celine was watching from the Capitol walls, because thousands of soldiers on both sides needed to see their king refuse to quit, because somewhere in the wreckage of his life, there had to be meaning beyond violence and legacy. Brennan's blade found gaps in Aldrich's defense, opened new wounds, drove him to his knees. The Chancellor stood over him, sword raised for the killing blow. "Any last words?" Brennan asked. Aldrich looked up at the man who'd spent decades planning this moment, saw ambition and ruthlessness and everything his father had valued. "Yeah," Aldrich said through broken teeth, "I forgive you." The words seemed to freeze time. Brennan's expression flickered through confusion to rage. "What? I forgive you," Aldrich repeated. "For the betrayal, the conspiracy, everything. You did what you thought necessary to survive in a system built on violence. I don't blame you for becoming what the Empire demanded." He struggled to his feet, swaying but standing. "But I'm done playing by those rules," Aldrich said, "done measuring worth through conquest and control, done being what my father made me." The sword fell from Brennan's hands, not dropped in surrender, knocked away by an arrow that took the Chancellor through the wrist. Both men spun toward the shot. On a distant hill, Cassandra Thorne lowered her bow, her face carved from determination and debt finally paid. Brennan's soldiers surged forward. Aldrich's men poured from the gates. The careful duel dissolved into chaos as thousands of men crashed together in violence that would determine the kingdom's future. Aldrich stood at the center of it all, wounded and exhausted, and finally understanding what his father had never figured out. Real strength wasn't dominating others. It was staying human when everything pushed you toward becoming a monster. Real power wasn't controlling outcomes. It was choosing your values even when choosing meant losing everything. He raised his father's sword one final time and charged into the battle that would either kill him or forge him into something new. The outcome remained unwritten. The only certainty was that Aldrich Vane, king, betrayer, survivor, would face it without the armor of legacy or the weight of crowns, just a man, fighting not for victory, but for the right to define himself beyond what violence had made him. The armies collided with the sound of thunder, and the world exploded into steel and screaming and the terrible beauty of everything changing at once. Steel met flesh with sounds that would haunt survivors for decades. Aldrich crashed into Brennan's front line like a man who'd stopped caring whether he lived or died, which made him the most dangerous kind of fighter. His father's sword carved through armor and bone with the efficiency of muscle memory older than conscience. Men fell screaming, others retreated. A few stood their ground and died for loyalty to a chancellor who'd promised them a kingdom built on someone else's corpse. The truth was simple and brutal. Desperation makes monsters of ordinary men, but it makes gods of those already acquainted with darkness. Aldrich had spent 34 years trying to escape his father's shadow. Now, surrounded by enemies and bleeding from wounds that should have killed him hours ago, he finally understood what the old tyrant had known all along. Violence wasn't just a tool of power. It was a language spoken by those who'd learned that survival sometimes demanded becoming the thing you feared most. A spear thrust came from his left. Aldrich pivoted, let it pass close enough to feel wind on damaged ribs, then drove his elbow into the soldier's throat. The man went down choking. Another replaced him immediately. Then another. The press of bodies became suffocating, a tide of steel and screaming that threatened to drown him in sheer numbers. His vision tunneled. Black spots danced at the edges. Blood loss and exhaustion were catching up to choices made in rage and desperation. But somewhere beyond the chaos, Celine was watching from those capital walls. And if he was going to die today, and the odds suggested he absolutely was, then at least she'd see him go down trying to be something different than what he'd been. The thought gave him strength he shouldn't have possessed. Aldrich roared and pushed forward, his sword a silver blur that turned men into meat. Each strike carried the weight of every mistake he'd made, every person he'd failed, every moment he'd chosen legacy over love. The weapon became an extension of his guilt, carving atonement from the bodies of those who'd bet their futures on a conspiracy built by better liars. Somewhere in the carnage, he glimpsed Brennan retreating toward the rear lines, cradling his arrow-pierced wrist, shouting orders that his men were too busy dying to follow. Coward, Aldrich thought with something almost like satisfaction. At least I'm bleeding at the front. A mace caught him across the back, drove him to his knees. Stars exploded behind his eyes. For a moment, one crystalline moment, Aldrich considered staying down, letting unconsciousness take him, surrendering to the exhaustion that had been building since the night he'd destroyed everything that mattered. Then he heard Marcus bellowing commands somewhere to his right, rallying the royal guard with the voice of a man who'd survived worse battles through sheer bloody-minded refusal to quit. Then he saw Cassandra on that distant hill, still firing arrows with mechanical precision, each shot buying him seconds he didn't deserve. Then he remembered Celine's voice in the garden. Don't die. Live long enough to actually become the man you keep promising to be. Aldrich surged upright, caught the mace wielder across the jaw with his pommel, followed through with a thrust that opened the man from sternum to spine. He kept moving forward because stopping meant dying, and dying meant failing, and he'd done enough failing for 10 lifetimes. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes. Time lost meaning when measured in heartbeats and the wet sounds of violence. Aldrich fought through Brennan's front line, through the second wave, through reserves that should have broken him, but instead broke themselves against determination that had stopped resembling sanity. Men who fight for pay quit when the cost exceeds compensation. Men who fight for ideology quit when reality contradicts belief. But men who fight because they've got nothing left to lose and everything to prove don't quit until something puts them in the ground permanently. Aldrich was proving to be exceptionally difficult to put in the ground. He reached Brennan as the sun climbed toward noon, painting the battlefield in harsh light that made the blood look almost black. The Chancellor stood surrounded by his personal guard, 20 men in heavy armor who looked far more competent than the soldiers Aldrich had been carving through. These were professionals. Veterans, the kind who'd survived campaigns by being harder and meaner than everyone they'd killed. Lord Chancellor, Aldrich called out, his voice scraped raw. You wanted the throne. Here I am. Take it from me. Brennan's face had gone gray with pain and shock. His arrow-pierced wrist hung useless at his side, blood soaking through hasty bandaging. But his eyes still held calculation, still measured angles and assessed odds with the mind that had orchestrated conspiracies for decades. You should be dead, Brennan said. Should have bled out an hour ago from those wounds. Probably, Aldrich agreed. But spite makes a hell of a stimulant. He gestured with his sword at the carnage surrounding them. Your army's breaking. Half your men are already running. The other half are questioning whether you're worth dying for. Surrender now, and I'll let you stand trial. Keep fighting, and I'll paint this field with what's left of your rebellion. Brennan actually laughed, a sound scraped raw from disbelief. You're offering me mercy? After everything I've done? I'm offering you a choice, Aldrich corrected. The same choice I should have offered Victor Thorne before this all spiraled into massacre. Change or die. Become something different or get buried under the weight of what you are. The personal guard tensed, waiting for Brennan's command. The Chancellor studied Aldrich with eyes that had witnessed 3 generations of vain brutality, searching for deception or weakness. What he found seemed to surprise him. You actually mean it, Brennan said slowly. You've lost your mind to guilt, but you actually believe this redemption nonsense. Maybe, Aldrich said. Or maybe I'm just tired of being what my father made me. Tired of ruling through fear and measuring worth through body counts. Tired of waking up alone in palaces built on bones and wondering if this is all there is. He lowered his sword slightly, not quite surrender, but no longer active threat. I destroyed the only woman who ever loved me because I couldn't figure out how to be human instead of king. Lost a child I'll never meet because I was too busy being what legacy demanded. Watched my kingdom tear itself apart because I never learned there's a difference between strength and brutality. Aldrich met Brennan's eyes directly, letting the old chancellor see the truth carved into every scar. So yeah, I'm offering you mercy. Because maybe if enough of us choose differently, the cycle breaks. Maybe kingdoms can be built on something besides conquest and corpses. Maybe men can escape what their fathers made them and become something worth being. The words hung in the air between armies, revolutionary and naive and desperate in equal measure. Brennan's expression flickered through contempt to consideration to something almost like grief. Your father would have gutted you for that speech, the chancellor said quietly. My father died poisoned by advisors he'd terrorized for decades, Aldrich replied. Alone in his bed without a single person who genuinely mourned him. If that's the alternative, I'll take naive idealism over legacy. Brennan stood silent for a long moment, weighing choices that would determine not just his fate, but the direction of an entire empire. His personal guard watched him with the intensity of men whose lives depended on whatever came next. Then the chancellor did something that shocked everyone present. He dropped his sword. The weapon hit dirt with a thud that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Brennan raised his good hand in surrender, his face carved from exhaustion and something that might have been relief. I yield, he said, to your mercy and your insanity. May they both serve you better than my ambition served me. The personal guard lowered their weapons slowly, confusion warring with the realization that their cause had just collapsed from the inside. Marcus appeared at Aldrich's side, bloodied but alive, his scarred face showing rare approval. Well played, Your Majesty, though I still think you should have just killed him. Probably, Aldrich admitted, but I'm trying something different. He swayed suddenly, the adrenaline that had been keeping him upright finally exhausting itself. Marcus caught him before he hit the ground, strong arms keeping the king on his feet through sheer force of will. Get the king to healers, Marcus bellowed, and someone secure the chancellor before I decide mercy is overrated. Soldiers rushed forward, some supporting Aldrich, others binding Brennan in chains that promised trials instead of immediate execution. The battlefield was still littered with bodies, still reeking of blood and voided bowels and all the ugly realities that sanitized history preferred forgetting. But the fighting had stopped. The conspiracy had collapsed. And against all probability, Aldrich Vane had survived long enough to make choices his father would have considered weakness. They carried him back to the capital on a stretcher, his body finally refusing to cooperate now that crisis had passed. Consciousness flickered in and out. He caught glimpses of the city gates, heard cheering from soldiers who'd survived, felt the particular relief that comes after battles when you realize you're still breathing. Then darkness took him for a while. When awareness returned, he was in the royal bedchambers surrounded by healers working with efficient urgency. They'd stripped off his armor and clothes, revealing damage that made even experienced physicians wince. 3 broken ribs, deep sword cut across his back, arrow wounds in shoulder and side that had somehow missed vital organs through sheer luck, cracked jaw from the mace, dozens of smaller cuts and bruises painting his skin in shades of purple and black. One of the healers, an older woman who'd probably seen worse but didn't look happy about it, shook her head while stitching the back wound. You should be dead, Your Majesty, she said bluntly. Should have bled out on that field with wounds like these. Aldrich managed something between a laugh and a cough. People keep telling me that. Maybe I'm too stupid to die properly. Or too stubborn, the healer corrected. Now hold still. This next part's going to hurt. She wasn't lying. The stitching felt like she was sewing his spine back together with fishing line and spite. Aldrich gritted his teeth through it, focusing on the ceiling beams and trying not to embarrass himself by passing out. Somewhere beyond the bedchamber he heard voices, Marcus giving orders, servants rushing about. The machinery of empire continuing its operations despite their king being actively held together with thread and prayers. Then a familiar voice cut through the chaos. I need to see him. Celine. The healers tried to protest, but she must have given them a look that transcended rank and reason. Footsteps approached the bed. Then she was there, standing over him with an expression that mixed relief and exasperation and exhaustion. You're an idiot, she said. So I've been told, Aldrich replied. How bad do I look? Like you fought an army and barely won. Technically, I did fight an army. The barely winning part is generous. Celine's mouth twitched towards something almost like a smile. The healers say you'll live if infection doesn't set in. Well, that's something. They stood there. Well, she stood, and he lay there bleeding, in silence that felt different than the distance in the garden. Not comfortable exactly, but less broken. Like maybe the space between them could be bridged, even if the bridge would never be what it was. You kept your word, Celine said finally. Offered Brennan mercy instead of execution. Actually tried being different. Trying and succeeding are different things, Aldrich said. But, yeah, I'm trying. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers brushing his uninjured hand. The contact sent electricity through nerve endings that had been expecting rejection. I can't stay, she said quietly. Can't go back to what we were. The damage runs too deep for that. Aldrich squeezed her hand gently. I know, I'm not asking you to. But I can help rebuild, Celine continued. Can stay through the trials, help stabilize the transition, make sure the kingdom doesn't fracture the moment you show weakness. She paused, studying his face with an intensity that made him feel transparent. After that, I'm gone, she finished. Back to the coast or beyond. Somewhere I can heal without ghosts. Thank you, Aldrich said, for everything. For not giving up on this broken kingdom even after it cost you so much. The kingdom didn't cost me anything, Celine corrected. You did. The difference matters. Fair point. The head healer cleared her throat diplomatically. Your Majesty needs rest, lots of rest, and the Queen should probably not be stressing him while we're trying to keep his organs internal. Celine nodded, but didn't immediately release Aldrich's hand. Instead, she leaned down close enough that he could smell lavender beneath the medicinal herbs. Live, she said simply. Not for me, not for the kingdom, for yourself. Figure out who you actually are when you strip away the crown and the legacy. Become that person. Then she was gone, leaving Aldrich alone with healers and the weight of everything he still needed to prove. The trials began 3 weeks later. Aldrich presided from a throne he could barely sit upright in, his body still healing from wounds that refused to close properly. The great hall had been converted to a courtroom, filled with nobles and common citizens who'd come to watch justice play out in public, instead of behind closed doors. Victor Thorne stood trial first. The evidence was overwhelming. Conspiracy to commit regicide, ordering assassinations, attempting to steal the throne through violence. His daughter Cassandra testified against him, her voice steady as she detailed every crime her father had commanded. The verdict was never in doubt, execution by hanging, to be carried out at dawn. But Aldrich commuted the sentence to life imprisonment instead, overriding every advisor who argued for blood. He's earned death 10 times over, Marcus had protested privately. Probably, Aldrich agreed. But we're trying to build something different. Can't do that if we start the new era with the same solutions that defined the old one. Lord Chancellor Brennan's trial came next. Again, the evidence was damning. But Brennan's testimony revealed networks of corruption that ran deeper than anyone suspected. Bribery schemes, embezzlement, nobles who'd been skimming from royal coffers for generations. In exchange for cooperation, Aldrich offered exile instead of execution. Brennan would live out his days in a remote monastery, stripped of titles and wealth, forgotten by history, but breathing. The court erupted in protests. The common people demanded blood for blood. Even Celine looked uncertain about the mercy. But Aldrich held firm. Justice and vengeance aren't the same thing, he said from the throne, his voice carrying across the hall. My father ruled through fear and died hated. I'm choosing differently. These men will face consequences, but those consequences will be measured and just, not reactive brutality dressed as righteousness. He let the words settle before continuing. If that makes me weak in your eyes, so be it. I'd rather be remembered as the king who tried building something better than the one who maintained peace through terror. The trials continued for weeks. Dozens of conspirators faced judgment. Some were executed for crimes too severe to forgive, others imprisoned, a few exiled. But each verdict was deliberated carefully, weighed against evidence and precedent, conducted in public where everyone could witness the process. It was messy and slow and infuriating to those who wanted swift justice. But it was different, and different mattered when you were trying to prove change was possible. Between trials, Aldrich worked with Celine to restructure governance. They established councils with actual authority instead of advisory roles, created tribunals to handle disputes without royal intervention, drafted laws limiting monarchical power and protecting citizens from arbitrary arrest. Every change faced resistance. Nobles who preferred the old system might made right. Generals who thought democracy was just tyranny wearing friendlier masks. Even common people suspicious that reform was just another form of control. But slowly, painfully slowly, the kingdom began shifting towards something that resembled governance instead of barely controlled violence. Aldrich pushed the changes through willpower and the particular authority that came from being the king who'd fought an army alone and survived. He wasn't healed, probably would never be fully healed from wounds both physical and emotional, but he was standing, working, trying to be the man Celine had believed existed beneath the crown. The final trial took place 2 months after Brennan's surrender. Lady Cassandra Thorne stood before the court charged with conspiracy, attempted regicide, and murder of the unborn heir. Her testimony throughout the other trials had been invaluable, but she'd still committed crimes that normally demanded execution. The hall waited to see what justice looked like when mercy met genuine evil. Aldrich studied Cassandra for a long moment before speaking. She met his eyes without flinching, accepting whatever came next with the same fatalistic determination she'd shown on that battlefield when she'd fired the arrow that changed everything. "Lady Cassandra," Aldrich said formally, "you've confessed to crimes that carry capital punishment. You've provided testimony that dismantled a conspiracy threatening the entire kingdom. You've saved my life when you could have let your father's plans succeed." He paused, feeling the weight of every eye in the hall. "The law demands your execution," he continued. "Justice requires accounting for the child lost because of your actions. But mercy asks whether transformation is possible, whether people can become something different than their worst choices." Aldrich stood from the throne, ignoring the protests from healers who'd told him to rest. He walked down the steps until he stood directly in front of Cassandra. "I'm commuting your sentence to exile," he said. "You'll leave the kingdom within a week, never to return on pain of death. Your titles are stripped, your wealth forfeit. You'll live the rest of your life knowing you destroyed innocence for ambition that amounted to nothing." Cassandra's eyes widened slightly. "Why?" she asked. "Because someone once told me that real strength isn't dominating others," Aldrich replied. "It's staying human when everything pushes you toward becoming a monster. You made terrible choices, but you also chose differently when it mattered most." He stepped back. "Maybe that's not enough to erase what you did," he said, "but it's enough to let you live with it. Go, become someone worth being, and let guilt drive you toward something better instead of crushing you into nothing." Cassandra stood trembling, tears tracking down her face. Then she did something that shocked the entire court. She knelt, not in servitude or manipulation, in genuine gratitude mixed with grief. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving me a chance I don't deserve." "None of us deserve the chances we get," Aldrich said. "We just decide whether we waste them or use them to become something different." The trials ended after that. The conspiracy was dismantled. The kingdom was stabilizing. And Aldrich Vane stood at the center of an empire slowly transforming from fear-based tyranny to something that resembled actual governance. But standing there surrounded by reforms and second chances and the machinery of change, he felt hollower than expected. Because the woman who'd inspired all of it was preparing to leave. Celine came to him on her last night in the capital. They met in the gardens beneath the ancient oak where everything had started and ended and somehow persisted despite all the damage. "I'm leaving at dawn," she said without preamble, "heading to the eastern coast first, then wherever the road takes me." Aldrich nodded, his throat tight. "I know. I had Marcus prepare supplies. Gold, horses, letters of passage, everything you need." "I don't want your gold," Celine said. "Take it anyway. You earned it dealing with my catastrophic failures for 7 years." She almost smiled. "Fair point." They stood in silence, the space between them filled with everything they'd built and destroyed and couldn't repair no matter how many second chances got offered. "Did I change enough?" Aldrich asked finally. The question came out smaller than intended. "Am I different than I was?" Celine considered carefully before answering. "You're trying," she said. "Actually trying instead of just claiming you want to be better. That matters more than you know." She moved closer, close enough to touch, but maintaining distance that spoke to boundaries carefully preserved. But change isn't a destination, she continued. It's constant work. Choosing differently every day, even when it's harder than reverting to what you know. You've started that work. Don't stop just because I'm not here to witness it. I'll miss you, Aldrich said, every day for the rest of my life. I know, Celine replied. I'll miss you too. Miss who you were before crowns complicated everything. Miss the future we could have built if we'd both been different people. Tears reflected starlight as they tracked down her face. But missing isn't the same as going back, she finished. We both know that. Aldrich pulled her into an embrace, felt her stiffen, then relax into it. They stood there breathing the same air one final time. Two people who'd loved and destroyed each other in equal measure, finally accepting that some damage runs too deep for repair. When they separated, Aldrich felt something break cleanly instead of the jagged tears he'd been carrying. Be happy, he said. Wherever you go, whatever you build, be the person you couldn't be standing beside me. I will, Celine promised. And you do the same. Become who you actually are instead of what legacy demanded. She walked away into darkness, leaving Aldrich alone beneath stars that had witnessed empires rise and fall and rise again through cycles that made individual lives seem almost insignificant. Almost, but not quite. Because individuals made choices, and choices built worlds, and worlds could be transformed by men willing to become something different than their fathers. Aldrich Vane stood in his garden watching the woman he loved disappear into a future that didn't include him, and understood with perfect clarity that this was both ending and beginning. The kingdom was healing, the reforms were holding, change was actually happening instead of just being promised. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, life continued its small patterns. Farmers planting, merchants trading, children being born into a world that might, just might, be marginally better than the one their parents inherited. It wasn't redemption, wasn't forgiveness, wasn't anything resembling the happy ending stories promised when heroes made the right choices. But it was different. And different was all he'd been fighting for since the night everything shattered. Aldrich turned back toward the palace, toward the throne he'd nearly died defending, toward the work of rebuilding that would consume whatever years remained. He walked alone. But this time, the solitude felt like choice instead of punishment. This time, he was becoming someone who might eventually deserve the chances he'd been given. This time, the man mattered more than the crown. And that, finally, devastatingly, hopefully, was enough.